So I got a job at DC Thompson, but I was living with my aunt. My aunt wanted rid of me. So she pulled an advert out of a newspaper and she came up and said, "Here, John, why don't you move to Dundee?" Where DC Thompsons were looking for editorial assistants, and I said, "Well, I'll give that a shot." And that got me into the whole thing. And when I found out that DC Thompsons didn't actually pay their workers, I decided I would try going freelance. And here I am.
And so you went freelance writing then? Straight?
Yeah, writing, yeah. Well, my art didn't sell.
So Mike, how did you get it? I hear you might have been involved in book writing or something.
Yeah, I committed several acts of book writing over the years, and I'm not ashamed of it. Everybody else is ashamed of it. What really happened to me was I always wanted to be a comic book writer, but I realised it was hard. And then one day John Higgins nagged me enough and said, "You should send your stuff into 2008. And I did. And Andy Diggle was the editor at the time. And he sent me back a wonderful rejection letter that had all these lists of everything I did wrong. And so what I did was I did the same thing again, but didn't do those bits. And then around about the same time, and he left 2000 AD, so it was about a year and a half before Matt ever got back to me. And I mean, that's how I got into it. But I've been reading 2000 AD since Prog 1. So it was always a part of my life. And the fact that, I got a chance to actually write some of the characters that I grew up reading means that I have nothing original to say. So. Sorry about that.
So the panel's over.
Yeah.
Okay, Rob?
I was working as a journalist, and I've told this story before, but the first submission I ever did for 2000 AD, Dave Bishop sent me back a letter just before email, and he said, "Congratulations, you have sent in the most unoriginal future shock we have ever received." Said, "In fact, we first published your story in Prog 7 or something like that." And he'd taken the time to photocopy the actual story from Prog 7 and sent it to me. So he went above and beyond, which was nice of him. But no, I never intended to be a comic writer because I just didn't think it was something you could actually do for a living, frankly. I'd always loved comics. I was working as a freelance journalist, and I wrote one comic, and I went along to Bristol Comic Con, not here actually, in the Watershed, back when it was in the Watershed. And I was very fortunate that comics with a British company was starting out, and I just handed over this mound of script to them and went, "I've written a comic," and rather than treating me like an idiot, which I probably deserved to be treated as, they actually read it. And then they rang me a few months later and they kind of went, "Oh, we want to do this." And that was my first comic. It was called Class War. And they, fortunately for me, they teamed me up with an amazing artist called Trevor Hairsine. And suddenly I had an avenue into comics, which was never really my intention. So that's kind of how I ended up here.
And thought?
Reformed thought. How did I get into comics? I guess I always wanted to write comics, and as a teenager I wrote 2000 AD, to various writers via the editorial address, asking for advice on how to write, and bless him, the much missed Alan Grant wrote back to me and sent me a Strontium Dog script. I guess I was probably about 14 or something. It was part 1 of Incident on Major Minor, and I'd never seen a comic script before. I didn't know how to do it, and suddenly there it was, and I could sit down and see what he put on the page and then how Carlos adapted it for the page and so on. And it was like a big light bulb moment for me. I guess I was probably about 14. It was like, okay, how can I do this? I can't draw, but I can, if an artist can bring it to life and, make me look good, then I can hide my lack of talent behind good art. And that's been what I've been doing ever since. In terms of 2000 AD, I studied media studies at uni, and I did my dissertation on comics just as basically just an excuse to interview as many writers and artists as I could get in contact with, just to pick their brains for advice on craft and technique, storytelling technique. And so my dissertation was basically just a catalogue of, it's the equivalent of film studies for comics. It was a very nuts and bolts catalogue of technique. But I think the fact that I was taking that interest in the actual production of comics rather than looking at the finished product side, looking at more from the inside, I think that's what impressed Steve McManus and David Bishop when I applied for a job as an editorial assistant, which is how I started off. And yeah, I guess I stayed there for a total of about 4 years. I kind of worked my way through promotions until eventually became Tharg. You know, there's this ceremony where they kind of give you the plastic rubber mask, you know, and you've got to wear that in the office like for 9 to 5, which is kind of harsh. It's hot in there. But you know, after all, and I became Tharg about literally the same week that Rebellion bought 2000 AD from Egmont Fleetway. And so me and Matt, who like we brought on as my assistant, we had to spend half our time putting the comic together and the other half of our time traipsing around London trying to find new premises because Egmont Fleetway were going to kick us out. But I guess like after about a year and a half of Thargdom, I kind of like decided it was time to go and put my money where my mouth was and actually do what I was intended to do, which was write. Because I'm not really cut out for 9 to 5. And I don't think I was a terribly good editor, frankly. And I just wanted to go and tell stories. So I've been doing it ever since. That was like 20 years ago.
Did you ever do the nom de plume bit where editorial often would write on the side? Did you do any of that?
No, that always, like, David had a very strict rule, like, you know, editors should not write for the comic. And that, he invented that very strict rule after he'd written a lot of stuff in the comic that people didn't like. And like, well, to be fair to David, I mean, he and I were often kind of like, you know, daggers drawn with each other. But I think we both mellowed with age somewhat. But, you know, he's been very humble about just saying, well, you know, people didn't like my stuff, but I didn't have any objectivity about that. So I think that's reasonable, because, you know, it's easy. It would have been an easy position to abuse, you know, by using a pen name or whatever. Like you pay yourself under a pen name. So we didn't do any of that. I think I wrote like a bit of a Tharg, you know, one of those kind of Tharg stories. Like the credit was like TMO or something for the Mighty One. The first proper credit I got was for Lenny Zero in the magazine, but I wrote that for free, just so in order to save money, so we could get Frank Miller to do the cover. I've got to save the money from somewhere.
Yeah. John,
I remember that Frank Miller cover. My reaction was, he saw you coming.
This is the famous Frank Miller cover that's never been officially published, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, that's a good one.
Like David's feedback to Frank Miller was so offensive that Miller's reply was it like, tear up my invoice, return my artwork, and leave me the hell alone? Was that effect.
Wow.
And they did.
he never worked for them again. So, that's interesting. Can I ask, what's been your best job, hardest job, sort of question, as a writer?
Hardest job, probably it was the last part of A History of Violence. It took me a year. I just got stuck on it and I couldn't figure it out. And I said to the editor, look, don't worry. I know what I'm doing. I don't have to do your synopsis. And you know, it always works out. Well, it didn't work out. And finally, I was given the winning idea by Andy Helper's assistant, who told me about a real incident that had happened in New York with the gangs. And as I said, oh, that's it, yeah, well done. He didn't want to give the idea to me, but Andy needed the story. And so he stole it from him and gave it to me. And that was, you know, I often start out not knowing how I'm going to end the story, but I usually manage it, but in that case, I didn't.
Rob? Not me. I did a Doctor Who comic where I thought it'd be a really clever kind of way to play with the comic form, where the fact that this is difficult to explain shows that it was a mindfuck of a job. There's like page 1 was page 22 of the comic, and the comic started with all our characters effectively going, oh well, that worked out well. And then what they realise is time is moving backwards. So you started the comic at page 21, then you went page 22, 21, 20, 20. But at some point the Doctor realises that time is going backwards and goes, hang on, and has to actually try and fix it and flip it. And I thought this was a really clever idea to play with the comic form and time travel and Doctor Who. And then I tried to write it, and it's the only job where I actually wrote to the editor and I just can't do this. This is too difficult. And then what's the thing, the vortex manipulator, is it called? They wear on the wrist or something?
Yep.
That was the thing that got me out of it. About halfway through, oh, thank God for that. And it's like, now I can have someone jump between time. Anyway, time travel stories are really hard. Don't write time travel stories. Try and do it properly. I mean, most Doctor Who stories is he turns up and there's an adventure and then he has it and he gets back in the TARDIS. If you actually start playing with the mechanics of time travel, it'll twist your noggin. So that was
Because
hard.
if it was real, he could just go back to earlier in the adventure and then save himself all the trouble. The Doctor Who runs down the corridor, but if he was wise, he'd go back in time and just travel back to the other end of the corridor earlier. And that doesn't make any sense.
No, that doesn't.
The fact is that Doctor Who is kind of like, he's got a time machine, but he never actually uses it. It's funny what you're saying. I tried to write a Doctor Who story about a character who moves backwards through time while everybody else, we're all moving forward in time 1 second per second, but this guy lives his life moving backwards in time at 1 second per second. So it's about like intersecting with him as he passes in time. And I thought it was a really cool idea, but I just could not get my head around how to actually make that work as a story. And then Christopher Nolan made Tenet. Yeah. It's like, oh, that's how you tell that story. But that film is a total head fuck. Just trying to follow it, like you've seen the kind of flow charts that show the movement of time period. It kind of makes sense, but it's hard to follow. I'm simply not smart enough to write that. I gave up in the end. It's like, oh, it's just some bad thing.
So that's your worst one.
Well, I didn't. I ended up not even writing that story because it was too difficult. No, the hardest thing to write is just trying to keep Dan DiDio happy in anything at DC Comics, because he would just kind of want you to pivot. What that means is throw away your entire story plan and incorporate whatever random bullshit he pulled out of his ass that day. but then next week he changes his mind and you have to throw that away and do the next thing. And you after 6 months of that, and you haven't actually finished part 1 yet because you've rewritten it 7 times, that's the point at which, you know what, I might go and write something else.
Go to a different planet.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I got blacklisted at DC for 10 years. But now I'm back, baby.
Mike.
Yeah, I have difficulty with stories where if I don't plan because I plan everything. I always know the ending, and then I know where the characters start from, and I work out the route to get there. Like, if you're going on a nice country drive, you'll find some interesting places along the way. But I end up in cul-de-sacs and driving into canals, and so I do an awful lot of rewriting. But there was one dread one a couple of years ago where I wanted to set it in the middle of the Black Atlantic and have all sorts of pirates and stuff. I mean, it's great fun, but the first draft, I actually got to the end and, reread it and went, yeah, I've just wasted 3 weeks writing a big pile of poo. And I got in touch with Matt and said, yeah, I'm sorry, my own work isn't good enough, I'm rejecting it, and I had to rewrite it. But it was because I'd made too many changes on the way. Too many great ideas that made me steered here, steered there, and we ended up not where I was supposed to be. The story did not end the way it should have. And that was trouble. I was going through a particularly bad time because I had run out of biscuits. And, I hate to have to bring that up in the public, but it was just one of those things that was frustrating, and it makes you want to go, no, scrap the whole thing and start again. But then you go, yeah, but he's agreed to do this one, and there's money at the end of it if I get it right, so you force your way through it. But then I always find that through adversity, you end up with really interesting stories to tell at panels and conventions. Not this one, but yeah. So sometimes they're just hard, and sometimes the story just won't get told. And you still got to do it because somebody's got to, put food on the table and shoes and the kids, and we're not kids, but even so, we're saving a fortune. But it's never been particularly hard like that. With novels, though, that's a killer. Novels are awful because you can't blame the artist if it turns out bad. That's why I write comics.
So, leading on from your answer, how did the other panelists go about actually the process of coming up with doing a story? We had a series or a one-off. What's your process? Do you want to take it? Not particularly. Okay, John. Then.
Well, it's never the same. You start somewhere and then you move someplace else. You know, you might start at the ending of one story, you might start at the beginning of another. It's impossible to sum up. I couldn't tell you how I write a story because I never write one the same twice. The process is always different.
Yeah, I think it's similar for me. They start in different places depending on the story. Like sometimes, I mean, I come up with a lot of stories that are just original, like my own thing, not based on some other characters. But like I never really sit down and write those. I kind of write copious notes on them and get it all figured out, and then it kind of feels like I've done the work, even though it's not actually something that's publishable. Plus, also, just you want to get paid, so the money is in writing IP or whatever. Like 90% of the work I've done, 80%, is like an editor will reach out saying, hey, how do you want to write so and so, whatever. And so what I've learned is that my head can always convince me that I should take on a job because it'll help my career or it'll pay well or whatever. And sometimes my gut is like, no, you shouldn't, because you don't have a feel for this, or you haven't got a story, or like the feeling that you're going to get a story, I guess. What it is. It is like a gut feeling. And my gut is always right. And whenever I've ended up writing something that just becomes a nightmare, it's because I should have listened to my gut. Like, for example, with Daredevil, I just wasn't the guy. I shouldn't have been writing Daredevil, But whereas what I'm doing now, writing The Expanse, like, yeah, no, actually, I am the guy because I love that and I get it and I understand it and I know the characters' voices and I know what's appropriate and what's not. But where does the story come from? I don't know. Like sometimes you get inspired and sometimes you don't. I think a lot of the time with me, at least, I'm very non-linear the way I do things. I'm very disorganized and it's a very kind of organic sort of process. But often it's almost like seeing a movie trailer in my head where I don't quite know the whole plot yet, but I've got bits. I can see, like the highlights, the exciting bits that they would put in the movie trailer, or just like directions of travel for characters, or like two different ideas that would combine in an interesting way and then turn into a third thing. So it's kind of messy and organic like that. And with me, there's a lot of process of like I'm not, because I'm very scatty and forgetful. I've got ADHD, so my head's kind of all over the place. So I write down all the notes I think of in this kind of stream of consciousness kind of way, because otherwise I'll forget it again, And gradually it sort of coalesces. It's almost like putting a jigsaw puzzle together. There's a lot of different bits, but I don't quite know how they're going to fit together yet. And there'll come a moment where what is a random cloud of noise starts to sort of take shape and it finds structure, and like random elements become cause and effect. Like this happens because that happens, and then because that happened, then this happens, And I think that's the difference between a story and just a bunch of stuff that happens. It needs to become cause and effect.
Yeah, it should be with every story. Now, I'm not speaking for everybody, but for me, with every story, if you take out one element, the story fits. So that every story has to have every part of the story has to have more than one reason to be there, I find. Especially with a comic, because you've got so much, a tiny amount of space to tell things. Yeah, so, I'm quite like Andy, like that. I start off somewhere. Sometimes it's a line someone says or something I think of. One Dread story that came about because I was driving through a place called Blackrock, which is south of Dublin, and Blackrock has got 400 sets of traffic lights in the space of about 12 yards. So you just cannot get through. And I started thinking, what if you had some kind of connection, cybernetic connection in your head, so that they could sense you coming and they let you through. Like if the judges had it built into their own bikes, then they could be driving through the traffic. They never had to stop for a red light. And the more I thought about it, the more I started building up an idea of what if someone could hack into that and slow the judges down so they don't get to a particular location by a particular time. And then if they have that ability, they could sell that information to someone else. And then I thought, what if someone could track specific judges? What if someone could track Judge Dredd? What if someone had a psychic connection to Judge Dredd because something happened, and they could tell other people where he was at any given time? So that's why I ended up with a story called The Long Game, which is part of a much longer thing, which is the sequel is happening right now in 2018. But it's got nothing to do with the traffic lights. So I can still use that one for something else. And 2 ideas for twice one, I get paid twice. That's 20 quid, not just that. So that's the ideas evolve like that. But it's not, every story has more than just one of those ideas. It might have a dozen, or it might have fewer than that. But they come out of the ether, and it's up to us to, well, we shape the ether into something hopefully solid, or at least seemingly solid. That sounds very profound. Someone please write this stuff down. This is gold.
I think I think my brain's essentially very lazy, and I have to sit down and I have to work it, and I find the whole idea of a sort of like, maybe for some people, like they're touched by genius and like the whole story downloads into your head. I largely think that's bullshit, and yeah, it has once or twice that you kind of go, oh, I've got it, but most of the time you have to, it's like building a chair or something. You kind of know how stories work and what they need, hopefully, and then you sit down and you start putting the parts together. And while you do that, other ideas present themselves, but you kind of get the basics of what a story needs to actually, have a decent sort of structure. So yeah, I mean, for me, it's just I have to sit down and make myself do the work. I mean, but I say that, but I also think that if you get stuck sometimes, for me anyway, I'll go, oh, I've got nothing, this is just a waste of time. And I'll go and have a bath or something, and I'll be in the middle of a bath reading a book or something, I go, oh, the entire fucking solution just presents itself.
Look away from it.
Yes, yeah, when you're in the book.
There's a lot of suds and bubbles and rubber ducks in your stories, I noticed.
Yes, indeed. But no, I mean, but going back to what John said, I think every single time is slightly different. But I think if you know the basic rules, hopefully you can put a competent structure together and build out to that.
And so, you guys have worked for on your own IP and other people's IPs. Is there differences where you've created the character yourself versus where you're picking up somebody else's character, and sometimes you're maybe doing things like TV or is it more restrictive if you're doing Doctor Who or something like that?
Well, some people are really good at picking up other people's characters.
Thank you.
And some people are really crap at it. I'm one of the crap ones.
We're all copying you, though.
That's why I prefer to write my own stuff, because I get to make the rules. And I get to decide how things work. And I don't have to work to anybody else's framework, which is probably one of the reasons I've never done that much for America, because they like you to stick to their own framework. They like to see synopses, which I don't like to do, because I figure if I write a synopsis and I know what's going to go in a story, I'll be too bored to write it. So I like to make writing a sort of voyage of discovery for me as well. I like to have certain parameters of the story, certain sections of it in my head, and then just explore it as I go along. And often the whole story changes, like an incident might change the whole story, and it might become something entirely different. So if I'd done a synopsis for it the way like the Americans would like with their characters, I couldn't do that. And I just get bored, and I write crappy stories. So I'm no good at writing seldom good at writing other people's stories. Maybe sometimes like a character like Boba Fett, who I look on as Judge Dredd in drag. I can handle that, okay. I mean, it's pretty easy, but I thought I would do a good Xena warrior princess, and I was just terrible at it. So there are very few. I could do a good Batman. I understand Batman, okay, but most of other people's characters I'd rather not touch. I have much more fun doing my own, and they're more warped generally than other people's characters.
Yeah, I find there's definitely restrictions writing someone else's character. We're going to writing Judge Dredd. A whole bunch of us a couple of years ago had a bunch of Dredd writers had all of our stories lined up and ready to go, and then we got word from on high that was a thing called Chaos Day is going to happen, and we all went, well, we finished all these stories that will now not work in a Mega City 1 that's made entirely out of rubble and dust. But because it was so hard to try and come up with stories, we come up with things we wouldn't have come up with otherwise. I certainly did. I know, I'm pretty sure Al Ewing said the same at one point. One of my favourite stories I wrote is called The Forsaken, which is where a bunch of cadets who'd been fighting on Chaos Day disappear, and we go through their stories to find out what happened to them. But that could never have happened. So obstacles they help us to climb to greater heights sometimes. But at the same time, it's a pain in the proverbial and in the hole sometimes when you have to say, oh yeah, I can't do this because we don't know what the man in charge job is going to do with a certain character. So some of these things are awkward. But with Project Vex, which is entirely my creation and some artists, well, I can do whatever I want. So if I suddenly decide a character goes one way or something happens, but that happened when I was writing the first book. The Vex comes back to his ship where his prisoner is, and the ship has been attacked, and the prisoner has midnight indicating shame has destroyed all of the attackers. And as a throwaway line, it wasn't supposed to be in there, Vex says, I don't think I didn't notice the discrepancy between the number of torsos and the number of heads and limbs. And then she goes, well, you were gone a long time and I was hungry. And that completely changed the way her character was, so I had to go rewrite it to fit. But that couldn't happen if I was writing an existing established character, or less likely to happen.
Yeah, I mean, Create Your Own there's pluses and minuses. There's way more freedom. You are potentially not going to earn as much money. But I mean, I'm doing a Create Your Own at the minute, and there's no editor, and it's a blast, frankly. Which is weird because I genuinely, for the most part, as long as they're not idiots, believe that a good editor is a really positive thing. You know, you need a sounding board. You need someone to go, oh, you might want to have a think about that again. That's a useful voice to have. But it is nice after like 20 years of me doing this to just kind of go there. You know what I mean? And I'm really, really enjoying it. Yes, but it's also part of the job. I mean, there's not many of us can afford to just do Create Your Own. You work on other people's characters, and you can have a really good time if you find a voice within that for yourself. Or like Andy says, sometimes, you know, with Marvel and DC, you can be given a certain character and you can go, I'm not the right person for this at all, but you try and make it work as best you can. But yeah, I mean, more freedom in Create Your Own is it's all you, for good or ill.
Yeah, no, I agree with all that. I think it's hard to generalise because it depends on the character, depends on the IP, you know. When it's superhero stuff, then I'm usually not the right guy because I didn't grow up reading that and I don't really have a feel for it. But like with John Constantine, for example, when I was writing Hellblazer, I just like, I totally know how to make this work. I totally know how this guy talks. So that comes very easy because you've got that kind of foundation to build on of like really good writing by those previous writers. So I found that came very naturally to me. And I find the same thing now with The Expanse. I kind of know the characters and I know how they talk. One of the things that bugs me about comics is when characters all speak with the same voice. You see, we were talking before about before the panel about like a lot of American comics feel rather homogenized. There's a kind of a house style, but you want that individual voice. So I always want characters. You should be able to tell who's speaking just from the dialogue. Because everybody speaks in a different manner. I'm rambling. I can't remember what the question was. What's easier? Yeah, but at the same time, doing your own thing. I haven't really done very much Create Your Own at all. But recently I did this Comixology Originals book called Cold Iron. That was like a story I've had cooking in the back of my head for years about the Isle of Man, which is a place that I've got family connections there, and lots of memories of the place. And there's a certain atmosphere I wanted to evoke of me being a kid there exploring places tied to kind of old fairy stories and mythology and stuff like that. And it's got a very, it's kind of like local hero meets Pan's Labyrinth kind of vibe to it, and like that's not really a traditional sort of something that's going to sell in comics, but like but I know exactly how it's supposed to sound, so I'm just going to do this anyway. It won't make any money, but I kind of don't care because I just want to get it out. And so it was really nice just writing these characters who are just so completely different from anything else I've ever done. And that was nice. But yeah, like you say, you also want to get paid.
I can understand the frustration of people who are trying to write stories for where somebody is controlling it and they don't quite know what's going on. I remember when Gordon Rennie was wanting to write a lot of Dreads, one day I passed him at a convention. He said to me, "Are you not dead yet?"
A little red sunshine.
That's Gordon. You gotta love it.
So, just before we go Q&A, I've got two editors on the panel. What's it like being, from the other side, from the editor side, handling a writer?
Those bastards.
I am absolutely not the guy to ask this because I was a terrible editor. I don't know. I was young and foolish and had no idea what I was doing. All I had was like, what I felt it should be like. But I wasn't trained, so I just asked lots of questions. The irony was that when I'm talking about that dissertation I did, and I'd interviewed like lots and lots of writers and artists for advice, talk about Alan Grant and so on. And I can't remember, did I interview you? I don't think I did when I was a student. I don't think we met until I worked at the college.
No, we didn't.
But the weird thing was that I ended up like not only working with half the people I'd interviewed, but then like became their editor. And it was like, this should be the other way around. So yeah, but I think, and also, I've always been far too blunt, and I wasn't sufficiently empathetic with creators, because now I've been doing it 20 years myself. It's kind of like we're all kind of paranoid. You send your stuff off and hope to hear back from the editor. You want a pat on the head. You want a bit of vindication. You want a bit of encouragement. A good editor, like people like Will Dennis, like I worked with at Vertigo, who was great. He would just once a week he would just like ring up and shoot shit, like, how's it going? And just talk. And nowadays it's all very kind of, it feels very impersonal. And like, you send a script off and it's like dropping it down a well, I don't hear back. And it just, you want to know if you're doing okay, You just want a little pat on the head. So if I could go back and do things differently, I would just develop much more. I'm still friends with everybody I worked with in 2008, apart from that one guy that we're not going to talk about. Which is nice.
No, please do.
But if I could go back and change one thing about my editorial style, it would just be to have a bit more heart, about because it's hard being a freelancer, and it's hard being an editor too because it's like a weekly comic is a real grind, it's hard and we're all struggling, and I should have been a little bit more empathetic.
Okay. Anyone want to add? Mike, you're known for writing, your
yes.
Journey Planet and your Rusty Staples.
Yeah, I've done a bit of that. I've done a fair bit of editing too. Editing novels is a pain because it's changing it. Yeah, to get the writers to change stuff because it's not working and they think it's fantastic is very tough. But then I've had a lot of trouble with my editors in the world who hate my stuff, so I think it's important for me to put that back out there. That pain goes all the way. Yeah? No, it's I quite enjoy editing. I really like the idea of taking a novice writer and nurturing them and getting them into up to speed. But then you can only go so far because if you train them too well, then they take work from you in the future, and that's not what we want. What we want to do is discourage other potential writers from getting out there.
Really bad advice, so don't muck up.
That's true. You tried to do that with me and you failed, and I became a great success. And here I am now. I mean, I'm sitting nearest John, that's how good I am. We sit in his shadow though, that's the thing.
Yeah.
Well, no, everything is great, but it's not like creating. It's
We do
very,
tend to encourage artists, though.
Yes, that's
They're
true.
not going to take work from us.
Yeah. Well, we don't encourage artists to write their own stories.
Oh, no.
Last year at they had a Skill and Comic Fest afterwards. I was chatting to a guy called Declan Shalvey, who's a young Irish artist and who is phenomenal. And he was saying, yeah, he's writing his own stuff. He said, yeah, I've been encouraging the other artists to write their own material. And I'm going, no. That's food from the mouths of my non-existent children that you're taking there. And so we don't want that. We want artists to think that it's really hard to write. We don't want them to know the truth. If there's artists listening, that bit was just a joke. Because it's really hard, isn't it? That's the case.
So should we take some questions? Any questions? Back there.
How does the writing process change when you're working with others? A couple of you have co-written stories, Aliens vs Predator. You're long-standing with that.
It's totally different, really. It's like playing bat-ball, really. You bounce ideas off each other, and some stories really improve from having someone like comedy, good action, having that double source of ideas is a good thing, but anything with a strong emotional content generally is too personal to work with anyone else. So it is a totally different process.
How did you and Alan, if you ever had like butted heads on an idea, how did you, because if it's three of you, I've co-written before, there's three, and it's like, well, decide and vote, right? Because it's 2 against 1. So how did you decide who, how to get across?
Well, because I was the senior guy, you generally but in the end it split us up.
Right.
There was a couple of stories that we just couldn't agree with, we weren't getting anywhere on. One was The Last American, where we were arguing about a few simple words, and going back and forth. I think we were just getting stale together. And Chopper, where we had a disagreement about what should happen in it. And, well, it was going on for days and days and weeks, and in the end we just decided that was, time to split up, and it did him the world of good, and me too.
Right.
But we still got together at night, and we're still friends. We didn't get at each other's throats, and it worked quite well, because some of the best stuff we wrote together after work, after a boring work day.
Andy?
Yeah, I've co-written not many, but a few things. But I fell over backwards when you invited me to co-write the Dread Aliens thing, because I was editing.
You were Aliens, I didn't.
Yeah, well, I'm a huge Aliens nerd, so I was a Dread nerd. And, I can't remember how the whole thing came about, but I think I was just throwing ideas at you. You were kind of fishing for ideas, like, we could do this, you could do that, and in the end it was like, do you want to co-write it with me? Yeah, but also
You can do his voice as well.
but it was also terrifying because, I've been reading this guy's stuff since I was 10 years old, But I went around your house for a weekend, right? And we just kind of battered ideas around. And...
I tried it with Garth too, but he just had so much energy.
He's way too enthusiastic.
Garth, I can't do this.
You had less energy.
I was born tired and cynical, so it's fine.
Yeah, no, I think you were a bit more laid back.
But I think the way we did it was because it was 6 pages of Dread for 2008. So we do 4 of those would make 24 pages for a Dark Horse reprint of that. So we kind of broke it down that way. And I think you wrote the first 4, and then I would rewrite them. And I would write the next 4, and then you would rewrite them. That's what we did. And then we kind of airbrushed over each other's work until it kind of you couldn't quite see the join, I think. But that said, I was basically trying to write something in a John Wagner style. I don't know. And you were kind of oh, you've done that wrong. You would never say that.
I'm sure it wasn't like that.
We faked it fairly effectively. I faked it.
Any other questions?
Yep.
That chap over there.
You've all had great collaborations with artists, and because of the collaborative nature of comics in that way. So in those collaborations, you know who you're writing for. Also, the nature of comics is that you sometimes don't know who you're writing for, and so that obviously changes it. So kind of how does it change in a way? Do you have a different head on when you're writing for an artist you know and for an artist you don't?
Yeah, if you work with someone a bunch and you know their strengths, you can play to their strengths, and you also know you trust them to actually you know, I mean, I've worked with like Henry Flint and Disraeli and Chris Weston, and I know what I can do, and they will, yeah, they will sort of like, you know, tell the story beautifully anyway, and I don't have to worry about it. Well, you know, when you work for DC and Marvel and whatever, sometimes you don't know, and the pages turn up, and frankly, occasionally you're horrified, and you're there with your head in your hands, and you're kind of going, right, okay, what have I got to do to rewrite this to actually to make it work, you know, which is not the best way of doing it. So, I mean, for all of us, I imagine, we've all got people we've worked with a number of times, and it's good, so you just want to carry on working with the people who are good, basically, who can sort of, you know, tell your story in the best way possible.
Yeah, true. Plus, if you know the artist well enough, then you get a kickback. Did I say that out loud? No, I used to work a lot with PJ Holden until it suddenly stopped happening, and I must check in with him. Does he think that I told Tarek not to assign him? Because I didn't. But when I was writing stuff that I knew PJ was doing, then I could shortcut it. I could just, you know, very simple panel descriptions and say, you know, just do this, just do that. And then he would just draw his own thing anyway, because he doesn't pay any attention to the script. But then with John Higgins, though, who I've known John forever, and John also doesn't pay attention to the script, so he just does whatever he wants. Why am I here?
Yeah, I find it really helps if you want to know who you're writing for, because you want to play to their strengths. You know, like different artists are good at different things. We've all got different styles and so on. So, like, you know, if this guy's really, like, you're writing for Simon Bisley, then you're going to want to, like, do lots of cool album covers, splash pages or whatever. You know, you're not going to want to draw, you're not going to want to give him, like, okay, I'm writing a very talky script at the moment. It's kind of character-driven drama. There's lots and lots of dialogue. And I'm like, does this not feel like comics? So I went back to look at Preacher. Like, okay, I had, you know, Garth Ennis and Steve Dillon do these incredible dialogue-driven scenes. They've gone for pages, but it never feels stale, because, like, there's always life in the, like, visually it never feels stale. With Steve Dillon, there's always kind of knows how to move into close-ups, capture nuances and expression and so on. So if you know that you're writing for a Steve Dillon, then you're going to write that in a different way than you would if you knew Simon Bisley was going to be drawing that same page. They're both amazing artists, but just in very different ways, you know. And like, especially in American comics, 9 times out of 10, you just don't know who's going to be drawing it, you know. And often I've found that, like, often the artist doesn't actually speak English as the first language, so there's often translation issues. And so you want to write it in a simple style. But, like, for example, I've worked with Jock for so long. Not so much nowadays, because he's a big megastar and left in his dust now. But you know, I tend to write. I think probably John's scripts are the biggest influence on my writing style. You know, like they're very sort of terse and brief and just to the point. But to just you want to try and evoke an image in the artist's mind without being like tediously prescriptive about everything. You know, just give them the wiggle room, inspire them, but let them do their thing. And Jock, I've adapted that kind of style, and then Jock just gets it. You know, I think because we'll see a picture in our head when we read a script, and Jock seems to see it the same way I do. Whereas, like, other artists sometimes will just do, like you say, it's so wildly different from what, like, how could you think that was the appropriate thing to do? Because you just can't tell what's happening, you know.
I did a Suicide Squad script that an Argentinian artist drew, and the language difference, and I wrote that there was 10-foot tall super soldiers walking through the corridors of his prison, and the pages came back fully drawn and inked, and he'd drawn 100-foot tall super soldiers, and it's like, well, it's a prison, they're going to be knocking down ceilings as they just walk. So that was a particular highlight of pages turning up and go, what the fuck do I do with this?
I've heard this story. I don't know if it's apocryphal. I don't know if it's one of yours, John, but possibly. I think Dave Bishop told me that there was a European artist once who drew a Dredd script where somebody was meant to be, Dredd was getting garroted, like, by somebody behind him with, like, using it like a cheese wire, you know, to garrot. And the guy mistranslated cheese wire, and he had the guy attacking Dredd with a slice of cheese.
I don't know about that, but there was a famous, I think it was a Mach 1 script, an Argentinian artist was drawing, and the script called for him to raise his artificial arm above his head. And the artist drew a guy with 2 arms waving an artificial arm.
And John, you've worked very you know, a lot with Carlos and now Dan. You know, do you enjoy working with the, you know?
Yeah, well, you like to work with artists who adequately represent what you're trying to say, and not only that, but working with an artist, you know, sort of changes the sort of thing you write. Like on Robo Hunter with Ian Gibson on the job. Well, of course I'm going to put in a lot of silly little robots because he draws them so well, and he's so charming. You know, another artist like I can't remember who the artist we started off with was.
Was it fair?
Was it?
Yeah.
He's not the same kind of artist, and it would have been a more dramatic and less interesting story than in Ian Gibson's hands. So they change what you do. You're working for a particular artist, and you work as a team, and things evolve in a different way.
Another question? Chap in the back.
Alright, so I would want to be a writer in the future, and every time I try to write a script, I think that, so I get my story, and that's all fine. I think the hardest bit is like, okay, I want that put that in like 8 panels, or like 2 pages or something. And I suppose my question is, how do you translate the story that you made, or like short, into a finite number of panels or pages?
The first thing I say is like end a page with a mini cliffhanger, right? Try and give it, don't just treat it like you're tumbling towards an end. Each page should have its own structure. So, and if you do that, hopefully you keep teasing people along the way and just build within that. And then sometimes, I mean, I do this all the time. I'll write a page and I go, there's too many panels on this. And then I go and try and see if I can combine 2 panels or and try and write the script and then chip it back. It's a bit like sculpting. You'll end up with something and you go, oh, this needs a bit more knocking off, and maybe I can knock this back there, and try and trim and trim and trim. But also, one last note I would say is just bear in mind it's a visual medium, and I think when we write the 2000 AD, I find this all the time. You can really fall into the trap of going 6 panels every page, and there's no dynamism on the page. If you do that, you've got to, you know, if you've got a big emotional beat, give it a bit of space. You know what I mean? 1 panel on the page. If that's the big panel on the page, well, give it a bit of space, give it a bit of room, which will mean you trim in something else elsewhere, basically, to allow that space.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say one of the best ways to start is to read a lot of scripts and see and compare them to the final product and see how it's done, because the artists will interpret the script in their way, and the writer's job, as I see it, is to tell the story to the artist. The artist's job tells it to the rest of the world. So if they decide a certain thing goes a certain way, they're usually going to be right, or at the very least, they're usually going to be culpable. So we don't have to worry too much about that. You just have to make sure that the artist knows what you want. I have a habit of this pages aren't in there. These are pages from some of our scripts, but on my one, I have.
That was yours.
Yeah.
It's got stuck.
Yes.
Can you spin it?
On
The next one is quite funny because you look.
So
At,
can
yeah,
I-
can you go back to that previous one?
Yeah.
Can you go back one more? There. Look
Yeah.
at how much dialogue there is on that page.
Yeah.
Guess who wrote that?
Yeah. John Wagner.
I've been meaning to ask you, since you're both here this weekend, is it true that Dave Gibbons once described your scripts, John, as, quote, a series of exciting telegrams? Like, you know, like famously, there's a spectrum of writing style, like in terms of how much information you put on a panel description. At one end, at the far end of the spectrum, you've got Alan Moore, who will write like a 6-page poem entirely in all caps, that's like 1 panel description. And at the other end of the spectrum, you've got John, who's like, dread, headshot, grim. That's all you need sometimes, you know, because like too much is just going to do the artist's head in.
It's a lot quicker as well.
Well, one thing I try and do, no, I not try, I always do, is make sure that I have 1 page of script representing each page of dialogue, or each page on the comic. The reason I do that is, well, there's twofold. First reason is because John Higgins said to me, oh, do it shorter, because then I have to pin 2 pages up above the board and that's a pain. And also it stops me from overwriting the panel descriptions, because I have a habit of giving too much detail or too much dialogue. If I force myself to be terse, which I'm not being now, then theoretically it should be easier for the artists, because my job is to make their job easier, I think. Or part of my job.
I heard that another Steve Dillon tip was that, especially when he was doing this from a John Smith script, was that he would just put like black marker through 90% of the panel description and just leave the relevant salient details. You know, it's kind of like, so yeah, we should aim to write that way in the first place. You know, just they don't need all this fluff. Just give it.
Brevity is there.
Yeah. But to come back to answering your question, right? How do you boil it all down? Turn it into bullet points, right? Think, like I agree with everything everybody said, right? Think visually. Try and tell a story visually. Like I absolutely agree that your job is to convey it to the artist, and it's the artist's job to convey it to the reader. So like try to convey it through visual action, rather than just exposition and dialogue or whatever. But yeah, that whole kind of another good bit of advice I got of Alan Grant actually, as a sort of practice exercise, was to take any American comic. Like I say American just because they tend to be like about 22 pages or whatever. That's like they're done in one story, and then cross out everything in the story. Literally, just mark a pen in the comic. Cross out the stuff that's unnecessary in order to tell a story, and try and tell a 20-page story in 10 pages. And then take that 10-page story, like, okay, how do I tell the same story in 5 pages? And just keep cutting it down and cutting it down. And that kind of process of compression is what 2000 AD is really, really good at. And I think that's why so many 2000 AD writers have gone on to success in American comics, because they've learned that compression, right? Because that brevity is kind of at the heart of comics. And you by chopping out the irrelevant fluff, it kind of distills it, into a more powerful form somehow. So yeah, and you could just use bullet points almost to kind of like, the old phrase, sometimes you have to kill your babies in writing. There's this scene or a line of dialogue that you really love or whatever, but yeah, sometimes you just got to be quite ruthless and chop it down. But I think that's quite good practice. Read Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics. There's a great sequence in there where he does this very long, convoluted story, and then he cuts it down until eventually, like a sort of, an 80-panel story becomes 2 panels, and it's the same story, and it works. You get it. And so, yeah, think in terms of. I'm rambling. I'll wrap it up. But basically, there's a thing he calls closure, which is it's like the Kuleshov effect in film, where you see 2 images juxtaposed, the brain automatically assumes a connection of meaning between those 2 images. That's the secret. Your brain fills in the gap between the 2 images, and so you can use that, and that actually involves the reader more as well.
And practice. You can't get worse through practice. You can only get better. So, if you think it's not working, that doesn't matter. Scrap it and start again. And if it's still not working, guess what? Scrap it and start again. And one day, eventually you will work. Once we said, if you want to be a short story writer, write a new short story every week. After a year, you will have to produce something. You cannot write 50 bad short stories in a row. You will get better. You won't get better if you stop.
Yeah, and write lots of short things. Instead of writing, one 100-page story, write 10 10-page stories. I'm talking specifically about comics here. 2 different reasons. One is you can try and write in 10 different styles. You can try and work in 10 different genres. You can try and work with 10 different artists. And each of them is a lot easier to finish. And then you get that satisfaction of finishing things rather than feeling of trying to roll the boulder up a hill. And, you described it earlier on before the panel as between writing a novel and a comic, there's like a marathon versus a sprint. So that little short 2000 AD style, that is a sprint. But it means even if you didn't feel like you aced it, you learned something from the process, you can finish it and move on.
Last orders at the bar.
The lights are going to go.
I'd even recommend you write 1-page stories, because it's a lot easier to get your head around that, and it's a lot easier to see how the pacing works, how you build up to a punchline at the end. Try 1-pagers before you go on to the 10s.
In terms of, I agree with what you said about read lots of comic scripts as well. There's a great website called I think it's called the Comic Book Script Archive, and it's just got loads of scripts by loads of people. There's a bunch of my stuff on there. I think probably most of you guys have got stuff like that. I don't know, they've just catched it from wherever they can find on the internet and collated it. Like in screenwriting, there's a very strict house style for how you've got to format stuff. But in comics, like everybody's got their own style, you know, so there's no right and wrong way of doing it. There's a lot of leeway. So find what works for you.
There is a right way of doing it, it's John's way. Yes.
we just told you that, Joe. Complicated.
On that note, I'm being told to tie up, so can we say thank you very much for Andy, Rob,